Hello, welcome to the Quadruple D, and I've got a lot to talk about here today, so let's get into it. A video conversation between Tucker Carlson and U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee has ignited sharp debate across the United States. Viewers from the right and left alike flooded social media after the interview aired, arguing over what it revealed about Washington's posture toward Israel and about the priorities of American officials themselves. The flashpoint came when Huckabee defended Israel's military conduct in Gaza. Pressed about the killing of Palestinian civilians, he implied that the Israeli armed forces exercise greater care in minimizing civilian casualties than the U.S. military. And that assertion is contentious, of course. International human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, have documented repeated Israeli strikes on densely populated areas. The United Nations has reported tens of thousands of Palestinian deaths since 2023, many of them women and children, and the death toll cannot truly be known, but it is estimated to now be in the hundreds of thousands. So Israel maintains that it targets Hamas infrastructure embedded in civilian areas, but the scale of destruction suggests that systematic disregard for civilian life is the norm for Israel, and Hamas is just being used as a permanent excuse for all sorts of atrocities. So what am I talking about? What sort of atrocities? Well, there have been attacks on children. If you look at the casualty numbers, according to the United Nations and Gaza Ministry of Health, nearly 20,000 children have been killed since October 2023. UNICEF reported that in early 2025, an average of 100 children were killed or maimed daily during intensified operations. There are also a lot of sniper and drone allegations. Multiple foreign doctors who volunteered in Gaza documented patterns of children, some under age 12, with single gunshot wounds to the head or chest. A UN Commission report stated there are reasonable grounds to believe Israeli snipers have intentionally targeted children, even those clearly recognizable as such. And in the occupied West Bank, at least 49 children were killed by Israeli forces and settlers in 2024, many with live ammunition. And there's a record fatality number too. 2024 was the deadliest year on record for humanitarian workers, with nearly half of the 383 global aid worker deaths occurring in Gaza. World Central Kitchen was also attacked. In April 2024, an Israeli drone strike killed 7 WCK workers. An internal IDF investigation called it a grave mistake due to misidentification, leading to the dismissal of 2 officers. However, organizations like Doctors Without Borders rejected this narrative, citing it as part of a broader pattern, and obviously, the people who were fired over that might have just been sacrificed for public relations reasons or whatever you want to call them. There has been systemic targeting. Reports indicate more than 400 humanitarian personnel, including over 280 UNRWA staff, have been killed by Israeli forces since the conflict began. And then you can look at the schools and hospitals, the infrastructure damage there. Statistics from late 2025 show that approximately 95% of schools and universities and all hospitals in the Gaza Strip have been either destroyed or damaged. There has been a targeting of shelters. Schools being used as shelters have been repeatedly attacked. For instance, children were reportedly killed while playing in schoolyards at the Gaza Girls' School and the Khalil al Wazir School in 2024. There's been a health system collapse. By early 2025, there were reportedly no pediatric hospital units left in northern Gaza after the destruction of Kamal Adwan Hospital. And that's of course intentional. It's not just some sort of accident. No, this was intentionally done. There's also been deliberate starvation and you know uh, uh, all sorts of things implemented by the government of Israel. Israel maintains that it does not target civilians, which is laughable at this point. Well, also disgusting at this point, but that's what they've claimed. They claim they follow international law, and they always blame Hamas for embedding military infrastructure within civilian sites. And I remember that during the Iraq War, that's one of the arguments I would always hear when it came to the United States murdering civilians then. It was always claimed, oh, they're using them as human shields. That's the constant argument when it comes to these warmongers and the civilian death tolls. And Mike Huckabee, getting back to him, he also dismissed criticism of his past support for Jonathan Pollard, the former U.S. Navy intelligence analyst convicted in 1987 of spying for Israel. Pollard provided classified material to Israeli handlers who served 30 years in federal prison before being released on parole in 2015. Israel granted Pollard citizenship and later welcomed him as a hero. And Huckabee has long advocated clemency for Pollard and defended meeting him, a stance that really shows the way that Huckabee is really interested in catering to the far right government of Israel. And in the interview, Huckabee invoked Israel's biblical right to the land and repeatedly referred to the occupied West Bank as Judea and Samaria, terminology favored by Israeli settlers and religious nationalists. The West Bank has been under Israeli military occupation since the 1967 60-day war. Israeli settlements that are considered illegal under international law by most of the global community, including the International Court of Justice, uh, though Israel disputes this interpretation, of course. And today, more than 700,000 Israeli settlers live in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, complicating prospects for any two-state solution. And throughout the discussion between Huckabee and Tucker, Huckabee often spoke of Israeli interests as though they were indistinguishable from those of the United States, using we in ways that blurred national lines. He argued that tensions on Israel's northern frontier with Hezbollah in Lebanon are matters Americans should treat as their own. And since late 2023, there have been rising fears of a broader regional war and sort of a World War III scenario. Huckabee's background makes his ideological commitments unsurprising if you actually look at it. I know it seems like because he likes to rock out with a bass guitar and stuff, he seems like he might be a hip and cool guy to some goofballs out there, but no, he's a religious loon. He's a former governor of Arkansas, of course, and an ordained Southern Baptist minister, and he is long aligned with apocalyptic Christian Zionist theology, which is obviously the safest kind. I'm being sarcastic with that one. Anyway, Mike Huckabee's Christian Zionist theology is deeply rooted in what is called dispensational premillennialism. Try saying that 4 times fast. It's a bit of a tongue twister. It's an evangelical framework that interprets the modern state of Israel as the fulfillment of biblical prophecy and a necessary catalyst for the end times, aka the apocalypse, and the second coming of Jesus. So you got to wonder, like, why would Jesus require these things to actually happen in order to come back? It's a very strange set of circumstances to tie the salvation of mankind to the military powers of religious lunatics on the you know political scene. It's almost like this is a bunch of nonsense, and that these beliefs are driven by hateful, power hungry lunatics or something like that. I don't know. But as U.S. ambassador to Israel, his views are frequently described as apocalyptic or doomsday, and his approach to foreign policy is certainly representing that. He's focusing on biblical prophecy rather than traditional diplomacy, and unfortunately, there are too many, not only Republicans going along with this, but even a lot of Democrats are similarly feeding this apocalyptic religious lunacy, like John Fetterman, for example, who is like a giant ogre who just loves the death and destruction that Israel is imposing here. And if you look at John Fetterman, I think he was always a Trojan horse. Now, there are some people, like even Kyle Kulinski, who I respect, who often attribute John Fetterman's views to the stroke that he suffered, and the idea is that it scrambled his circuits in his brain and suddenly made him transform into a right winger. But I think he was always a Trojan horse, similar to that Kristen Cinema or Kirsten Cinema, whatever. Who cares what her actual name is? Part of Kirsten Cinema's story, her backstory, is that she grew up poor in a gas station, and she used that as a selling point of how she knows what it's like to be poor, and she's going to be a real progressive fighting for the values of the genuine progressive movement and whatnot. But of course she ended up being way too aligned with the right wing, and it made me think, well, maybe she should have just stayed in that gas station that she grew up in or whatever. It was like an abandoned gas station. It's a bit of a weird story, but you know, you got to wonder, like, what would happen if some of these people never got to become these Trojan horses, and how much better society might have been. I mean, you could do a whole bunch of what if scenarios, really, and it could drive you up the wall. But nevertheless, it's food for thought. And when it comes to the key tenets of Huckabee's apocalyptic theology, it's really freaky. The second coming catalyst is, at least what Huckabee believes, that geopolitical events in the Middle East, particularly concerning Israel, are paving the way for the return of Jesus. It's an expansionist biblical view. He supports the notion of a greater Israel, including the occupied West Bank, which again he refers to as Judea and Samaria. And he stated that Israel has a God given right to land extending from the Euphrates to the Nile. So he's rejected a two-state solution. He's consistently rejected it, viewing the entire region as part of a biblical mandate. And this is all part of an end times acceleration belief. His approach encourages an end time scenario where evangelical Christians view the often violent final conflict or Armageddon as preordained. It's really just deadly diplomacy at best. This theology has been described as a bizarre death cult masquerading as statecraft, and that's exactly what it looks like. It suggests a scenario where most of humanity is destroyed, and Jewish people must eventually convert to Christianity or perish. So it's actually, as a lot of other critics have noted, it's actually itself an anti-Semitic belief system, because it's believed that these Jewish people must convert to Christianity, or they're basically going to suffer in hell forever. And of course, there's also opposition to Palestinian existence, Huckabee's rhetoric has been about essentially denying the existence of the Palestinian people and advocating for the annexation of Palestinian territories. That's why they don't care what happens to them. They could all be destroyed, literally, and it'll all be justified because what about Hamas? What about Hamas? You could destroy every last one of them, and it will be justified by these right wingers because Hamas was a thing. So that's all part of the support for settlement expansion. Huckabee's views align with the Israeli settler movement, which aims to secure full control over the West Bank. And Huckabee is just a big part of that now. And despite all these critiques that I've made here, Huckabee has argued that his and other Christian Zionist support for Israel is not inherently anti Semitic, but rather an affirmation of the Jewish people's right to their biblical homeland. However, remember that important little bit of information. His theological stance is that Jewish people must eventually convert to Christianity or perish. And this is one of the obvious dangers of having either an ethno state or a theocratic state. And not only do you get uh, murderous scenarios like these complete annihilation campaigns as a possibility, but even just logically, if you think about it, when you ask for a theocratic state or an ethno state, what you're really saying is that I want my religion to be blamed for uh, anything that the government does in the name of that religion. So you're basically asking to be eventually retaliated against or scapegoated. So, like, let's say all these white nationalists, white supremacists actually do successfully transform the United States into a whites only society and government. Well, not only does that still seem unlikely, but putting that aside, let's say they actually did it. Um, that means that anytime the United States government does something rotten in the world, then the United States is asking for every other non-white society on the planet to hold white people in general accountable for what the government does. And the same thing is true of a theocratic government. So like if an Islamic or a Jewish or a Christian government does something rotten, that government is literally asking for the rest of the world to hold that religion accountable for, whatever the government does. You know, it's asking for all of the people of that religion to be targeted, basically. So that's why we need to move past the concept of the ethno state and the theocratic state. And interestingly enough, the United States was supposed to be a secular government. And that's what these right wing dipshits never understand. It's right there in the First Amendment. Sep- the government does not have a right to establish a religion, an official religion. And now we better understand and recognize the dangers of that. And of course, you have lessons all along with like World War II when Adolf Hitler tried to establish a, a white country. And of course, one of the lessons there is that it wasn't the case that Nazi Germany only wanted Germany to be white. They were an expansionist thing. They attacked other countries, they persecuted people around the globe. So it's never the case that these people just want to have different societies and all these different groups could live in peace and la 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 la. You know, it's not it's not a utopian vision. It's always a government expansionist vision and a supremacist vision that seeks to conquer other people. Because remember, the aim is to say that we're better than everybody else, we deserve to run the world, etc., etc. And of course, there is a sadistic element to it. These supremacist types, whether it's white supremacists or religious supremacists, whatever, they they really like to torture other people, basically. And that's why the cruelty is always going to end up being a factor here. Now, they might deny it every once in a while, and even these white nationalists, they might actually make strategic alliances even with people outside of their own race. I mean, you found that with Hitler aligning with Japan, for example, and even on a prison yard, the white nationalist groups might, to some degree, fraternize with other gangs for whatever reason. You might find some weird stuff like that. And of course, you have like Kanye West uh, praising Hitler, and you got black Nazis and stuff, which is strange. But the point is, overall, those are just being those are just people being useful idiots to the white nationalist movement, or whatever sort of movement you can think of. Temporary strategic alliances, and then you have the phenomenon that, the white nationalist types, they like to use minorities as an example. Like if if a minority is praising like a white nationalist ideology or a leader and espousing its values, well, they like to use that as an example to say, see, even these non-white people agree that we're supreme, and we're smarter, we're better, etc., etc. So that's why you find sometimes non-white people being aligned and in some cases respected by white supremacists or whatever, because it's like a way of saying, look, even they understand that we're the top dogs, and all that kind of stuff. So it's a very strange and deadly scenario that the world is in right now. Anyway, back to the interview with Tucker Carlson. Ambassador Mike Huckabee articulated a literal interpretation of the Abrahamic covenant found in Genesis 15:18, which he described as the original deed to the land. So basically, that's like an admission that, it's a religious ideology that's dominating this. So it's another sign that, we're having a lot of these conflicts because of a lack of secular government. So when it comes to the Nile to Euphrates interpretation, Huckabee's theology posits that God's promise to Abraham's descendants defines the legitimate borders of Israel far beyond its current internationally recognized frontiers. So the geographic scope, he identifies the biblical river of Egypt, or the Nile, and the great river, the Euphrates, as the markers for this territory. And under this literalist lens, the promised land would encompass modern day Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, along with significant portions of Egypt, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia. When Carlson explicitly asked if Israel has the right to this massive expanse of the Middle East based on this deed, Huckabee responded, "It would be fine if they took it all." So, that's the nut that's, largely in charge of this stuff. And the theological basis is that this is an unbreakable covenant. Huckabee views the Genesis 15 covenant as an unconditional and eternal promise. There's divine ownership. He argues that the land was bestowed by God through Abraham to the people that he chose for a specific people, place, and purpose. So it's theological absolutism. He believes that for God to break this covenant would be anathema, effectively 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 placing biblical text above modern international law or diplomatic treaties. So in his mind, these wars are not lawlessness. he views this as being God's law. So, again, it's another example of the dangers of theocratic government. And he later characterized his statement about them taking it all as somewhat hyperbolic, and noted that the state of Israel is not currently seeking these borders. And that's sort of like a very small ability to walk things back. But he maintains that the biblical description remains the foundational truth of Israel's identity. And of course, the idea is that the Jews will eventually either convert or be destroyed. That's also a part of his view of Israel's identity. Keep that in mind, like when you think about these issues here. So, this has had a regional impact, of course. This literal interpretation has caused a diplomatic crisis in 2026, with over a dozen Arab and Muslim nations, including even Saudi Arabia and Egypt, denouncing his remarks as extremist rhetoric that violates the UN Charter. Now, it's a little bit surprising that Saudi Arabia took any issue with this because the United States is so closely allied to Saudi Arabia. But his confirmation as ambassador in April 2025 was celebrated by Israeli officials and major pro-Israel lobbying organizations in the United States, which collectively help sustain roughly $3.8 billion in annual American military aid to Israel under a 10-year memorandum of understanding signed way back in 2016. So, the US Israel relationship, it shows you how centralized governments forge military alliances that entrench surveillance, arms transfers, and so called security cooperation at the expense of ordinary people. American weapons manufacturers profit from the arms sales. Israeli defense firms test technologies in occupied territories and export them globally. Palestinians endure military rule and blockade, while working class Americans see public funds directed abroad instead of toward housing, healthcare, or infrastructure here at home. And the uproar over the interview may signal a growing unease among Americans who question whether bipartisan support for Israel reflects democratic consent or entrenched elite consensus. Huckabee's remarks crystallized a long standing concern that foreign policy is shaped less by popular will than by ideological commitments, so called strategic alliances, and powerful lobbying networks. Whether this renewed concern over Huckabee's extremism becomes a turning point remains to be seen, but it has intensified scrutiny of how and for whom U.S. power is exercised. So, I'm going to have additional parts of, uh, this episode that I'm going to record later, and it's going to be like a three-parter. But I got to give my voice a break right now because I've got a cold, and it's like affecting my ability to talk. Like normally, I would have done the other two segments just in this episode, but I got to give my voice a little bit of a break. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I mean, to the extent that such a topic can be enjoyed. I don't know, maybe you learned something, so you might have enjoyed it in that sense. Or maybe it just, got you thinking about the mess we're in, and maybe it'll, you know, help motivate you to apply pressure to our rotten government and decide which politicians to primary and stuff like that. So, yep, I'll record the other two segments later. And for now, just have a good day to the extent possible.